Chapter 1. Growing Up. Fields and Open Spaces. It has long been known that prior to World War II, Wednesfield had many open fields and areas of undeveloped land. The experience of this project's interviewees reveals just how wonderful this was for children growing up in the 1930s and 40s, in an age that felt more socially safe, where freedom to roam was only curtailed by the need to get to school on time or be home in time for dinner. The fields and the small pathways that navigated through them provided an atmosphere ripe for adventure and long days spent with friends. Much has changed since then, although judging by the number of strawberries that were liberated from cruel incarceration behind allotment fences, children have probably not changed a lot. Fields loomed large in the childhood travels of our contributors, not just as playgrounds, but also as part of the development of the area. For example, when the Regal Cinema was being built in the High Street in 1935, Marjorie could see it going up from her bedroom window in Bolton Road, just across a field. No fields there now. In the early days of the cinema, there were undeveloped fields to the rear of it that were simply known as the Regal Fields. Les recalls gaining access to Dickie Lewis's cornfield by climbing over the fence at the bottom of his garden in West Avenue. He walked his way around the field, coming out eventually at the top of Victoria Road, at the junction with the Cannock Road, where his grandad lived. Grandad lived in a terraced house that was laid back from the road. Here he would sit in the evening after work with a little barrel of beer, a round of cheese, and a wire cheese cutter, and there he would stay until it was time to go to bed. Right opposite Alf's childhood home, in the other Victoria Road, which runs parallel with Vicarage Road, was a large field where Parkhouse Avenue is now situated. There was a pool in one corner of the field, which it was rumoured was on the site of a former mine shaft, but that may just have been rumour. The field itself backed onto New Cross Infirmary. The residents of the workhouse would throw money over the fence to the children playing in the field to go and buy cigarettes for them. You had to give them the right change, though, or else. The King George V playing field in Amos Lane provided a base for a lot of happy young footballers. Despite the 19-year age gap between Ray and Alf, both generations enjoyed footy at King George's and the park. Ray remembers local tournaments such as Tithe Road versus Amos Lane and Mattox Road versus Wood End. Ray and his brothers, Ronnie and Roy, lived in Tithe Road at the time and so were often in the same team. Other teammates remembered were Freddie Homer and Roger Frazier. The opposition often contained the Bickley brothers, Johnny, Albert and Corky. Albert would be instrumental much later on in bringing Ray and his future wife Kath together. The playing field itself was under cultivation until as late as 1934. John G. had fields all around him when he was a boy. His family had moved from Wood End Road in the late 1930s, when his dad fell out of work and money became scarce. They went to live at Sandpits off Nooth Lane, which was just on the Wednesfield side of the border with Willenhall. At Sandpits there were 6 railway carriage houses set out in a square. John's 5 neighbours were the Birds, the Worseys, the Todds, the Landers and the Georges. John's grandparents lived about half a mile away at Nechel's farm. The farm had been there for centuries, but in his grandparents' time, the farming was largely confined to pig rearing, together with a few ducks and chickens. A chap called Walker used to bring a boar over to the farm every now and then for breeding, and John's dad had to pop over to the farm at certain times of the year to help clear out the rats. There were 2 fields at the back of the farm which a Mr. Brindley used to plough for cattle field. Mr. Brindley's cattle were brought out every morning to graze in the field. They had to cross a main railway track to get there and also cross over a brook. The brook was a tributary of the River Severn and ran through Lichfield Road, down to March End and straight on. It has been culverted now. The surrounding fields may have been a youngster's paradise, but the farm contained old pit shafts which, although fenced off, were not covered over. John was challenged by temptation and danger, all at the same time. The south side of Bolton Road used to have allotments behind the houses. Behind the allotments was the canal, and behind the canal, the railway line. Although this was a goods line, there were a few exceptional times when it functioned for passengers. For instance, a group of Sunday school children from St. Thomas Church were able to board a train there in the 1930s for an outing to Rhyl. Ken recollects the old railway station, which was not far from the waste ground behind his home in Well Lane. It was full of straw, and he and his friends spent much time playing there. All in all, the play areas, comprising fields and wasteland, were plentiful, but the general opinion that is in the 21st century they would be considered health and safety risks and would be securely fenced off. Children did play in the streets as well as open areas, and there does not appear to be anyone who did not enjoy the game of knock the door and run away. One version of this involved tying a piece of string or cotton onto the knocker of someone's letterbox and securing the other end in the same way to a house across the road. Not too tight though. One child would then activate one of the knockers, and when the parent pulled the door open, the thread would tighten and activate the knocker on the house across the road. How many knocks could you get before the game was up? It probably drove the adults crazy. But as has been observed, all the kids did it, and there were lots of us. So parents could not avoid the game, really. Hearth and home. John G. has memories of the interior of his grandparents' old house at Nechel's farm. He can recall a large stone staircase, 6 or 7 feet wide. The staircase turned part way up and brought you out into a large room with other rooms leading off on either side. John always thought of it as a dining room, but unfortunately for the historical record, this was as far as his rather strict gran would let him and his siblings go into the main part of the house. There was a large cellar beneath the house, accessed by 8 or 10 very wide steps, and in the kitchen area a big black cooking range, which had a movable plate to adjust the range's usable width. There was also a clockwork jack for cooking the meat. You could sit in the grate, 3 on each side, and a set of wooden stairs led up the side of the chimney. The farmhouse was a little different from John's railway carriage house, which was rather smaller and had no electricity or internal water supply. At one point the well, from which John's family drew their water, was filled in. From that time onwards they sought out an arrangement with a Mr. Alexander, who lived by Noose Lane Bridge, to collect 2 buckets of water each morning from his property. The site of these railway carriage houses is now a small nature reserve. Even in brick-built houses there was no guarantee of electricity being laid on. Certainly prior to the war, darkness was still often lit by gas mantles, frequently wall-mounted. The mantle was a small bag made of fabric, and it had to be set alight before use. Burning it got rid of any loose fibres, and the process hardened the material and produced a natural chemical ash, which when heated by the lit gas gave off a bright incandescent light. Milk was usually delivered to the door by the milkman. Often it was in churns, from which the household's milk was measured out into a jug. In Presswood Road there was a Midland Counties dairy, and Alf remembers the cold winter of 1947 when he and his friends took their sledges there to collect milk for the neighbours. There was a dairy opposite Marjorie's house on Bolton Road. It lay just in front of the field over which she had watched the Regal Cinema being built. Coal could be collected from the Canal Wharf by St. Thomas's Church, although when coal was rationed during wartime, John G. and Marjorie remember going coal picking. John on the waste areas of the local pits, and Marjorie by the railway line where coal had spilled over the sides of goods wagons. Lots of families appear to have kept chickens and ducks as well as pigs in their back gardens. John M.'s house in Well Lane was more or less opposite Lewis's slaughterhouse, where his family's pigs were butchered. Describing the site, John recalls that next to the Royal Oak Public House there was a little row of 6 terraced houses, then a strange building with an archway and big gates, then some fencing, and then a gate through which Lewis's abattoir could be found in a corner. Each New Year's Day John's dad would go to a pig breeder in Old Heath Road and buy 2 piglets for fattening up over the next 12 months. Neighbours used to bring their potato peelings and cabbage stalks, which would be boiled up in the old brew house at the back of John's house to supplement the pig's diet. Supplements to the diet of the human part of the population consisted of the chickens and ducks reared in back gardens, plus their eggs, together with delicious home-grown fruits and vegetables. For the latter, gardens and allotments needed to be kept well nourished with compost. Fallen autumn leaves would form a large part of homemade compost. Pre-bagged garden compost is a much more recent convenience. Alf's garden compost was enriched with hops, obtained from a neighbour who worked at Banks's brewery. Christmas was an enjoyable time, but not so opulent as it later became. Mothers were usually quite good at squeezing the household budget during the year in order to provide at least a small gift at Christmas. There was always the Christmas stocking with fruit and nuts rammed into the foot area. The rest of the sock? Well, it depended on the household budget. Ray had a white plastic ball one year. It cost 7 shillings and 6pence from Sidebottoms in Amos Lane. Outside into the yard he went with it, took aim, and gave it a good kick against the wall of his house. It burst. So sadly, that was Christmas over for that year. Marjorie's dad always managed to get a Christmas tree from somewhere, and it would be adorned with paper ornaments and real candles. Today that sounds dangerous, but nearly everyone who had a tree did the same thing. Alf's dad was a delivery driver for LMS, the London Midland Scottish Railway Company. Every year he delivered a barrel of Scottish whisky to the landlord of the Angel in the High Street, Jimmy Howe. By arrangement, he would take in a small medicine bottle, the sort with measures on the back, and Jimmy would fill it. It was very definitely full strength, Alf recalls. School. Most people who took part in this oral history survey did their primary schooling at either the school in Nechel's Lane or the one in Woden Avenue. Most young people left school at age 15 or 16 during the 1940s, 50s and 60s, and at that time school leavers could leave at Easter time as well as summer time, depending on when their birthday fell in the year. You left school on a Friday and usually started work the following Monday. No extended holiday.